All right, well, I'm a firm believer that the drum set has to sound good in the room, or there's no way it's going to sound really good on tape. So I'm not a drum professional, but I've had to tune drums a few times, and I noticed with this particular drum set, there's a little bit of problem here with the tom-tom. So Connor, the drummer, has allowed me to kind of come over here and do a little tweaking. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a drum key here, sort of loosen everything, because if you've heard it, common sense will tell you it's tuned a little bit high. So we want to loosen everything just a little bit, go through this basic, 2-3 minute procedure, try to improve it a little bit. Of course, when you're recording live drums, you usually want to have fresh heads. These look like fairly fresh heads, so that's a good sound. Okay, and then what we want to do is we want to sort of hear where the drum starts to speak on the top head. I haven't done this in a long time, but and you're just listening for a similar tone around the lugs. And then what I'm going to do is turn it around. I'm going to do the same thing on the bottom, but I want the bottom head to actually be tuned a little bit higher than the top head. That's very high. Maybe you don't want it that high. So we're going to work on this drum just a little bit, and hopefully it'll come out sounding a little bit better than it did initially. Go ahead and give it a shot. So if you notice now, the decay of the tom-tom speaks down instead of that warbliness we had before, right? Is it okay? Yeah. All right, that was a quick 2-minute fix. If we had a lot of time, we'd go a little further, but I think for demonstration purposes, that's fine. We'll come back in a minute, we'll let Connor play a little bit, and we'll get some drum sounds. So, we've talked about dynamic microphones, condenser type microphones, PZMs or pressure zone mics, and then the ribbon mic. I'll explain a little bit about my selection for recording the drums today. I've used dynamic microphones for the bass drum. For the main microphone, I've used an AKG D112, relatively affordable. It's got a large diaphragm like the RE20 that we talked about earlier. Again, picking up some of the low frequencies and not a lot of the high frequencies. Again, able to handle a lot of sound pressure level, thus making it a good microphone for the bass drum. Also, we've got a 421. This we actually talked about earlier, another dynamic mic. This is going to accentuate some of the low-mid punch of the bass drum. So I'm intentionally using the two mics to equalize the bass drum. I'm going to get some of that low frequency, some of that low-mid frequency, and together I'll combine those two microphones for a desired effect. I'm going to get up and go over to the snare drum now. And on the snare drum, I've used for the top a Shure SM57, again handling that high sound pressure level, accentuating some of the higher mid frequencies that we tend to get out of a snare drum. In the bottom of the snare drum, I've also put a microphone to pick up the bottom head of the snare or the actual snares. I've used a 451, which is this type of microphone here, only I've inserted a pad in the microphone. And the pad is a 20 dB pad that's going to allow that microphone to get the high percussiveness or sound pressure level of the bottom head of that snare that could get very, very loud. But the 20 dB pad on the microphone is going to allow us to record that with a minimal amount of distortion. Hopefully no distortion at all. Then I'm going to move over to the hi-hat. On the hi-hat itself, I used another condenser type microphone, a small diaphragm microphone. It's a KM84. It's a Neumann KM84 microphone. Again, this microphone is going to pick up a lot of the higher frequency and eliminate some of the lower frequency. So it's going to give me better isolation on the drums, where the bass drum mics are going to get more of the bass drum, less of the cymbals, and the cymbal mics are going to get more of the cymbals and less of the bass drum. Now, on the tom-toms, I've used a 421 again, has that nice low-mid punch that I'd like for the tom-toms. And on the bottom of the floor tom, I've put a condenser type microphone, a U87, and again I've applied a pad since there's a lot of sound pressure level likely to come through that microphone. Now for overheads, I've used similar mics on both sides. These mics are designed to pick up the cymbals and some of the top area of the drums. I've used 414s, which again are a good condenser type microphone. But in this case, I've also put filters in. And the filters I've put are high-pass filters, just like I talked about in the console earlier, where I could actually have that microphone just pick up the high-frequency cymbal information here, not some of the lower frequency coming from the bass drum or some of the tom-toms. Again, giving me better isolation on these microphones. Now, I've also selected some mics for the room. I want the opportunity to record the room that the drums are in and the sound coming through the mics as we hear the bounce coming through the walls in the room. I've used these nice 47 tube microphones for that purpose. Now, in your home studio, you may not have 10 or 15 microphones at your disposal where you could have all these nice mics on the drums itself. The important thing is that we realize dynamic mics make good microphones for drums for the most part, and condenser mics make good microphones for the cymbals or the hi-hats. Certainly, if you're in a room that has some ambience to it or some reverb, you want to try and get some room mics put up. It's also an opportunity for you to go to your local rental company and rent some mics for the day that you're going to record drums. Knowing that you're not going to need them every single day, maybe you don't have to buy them, but for that day that you're recording drums or the few days that you may decide to record those drums, if you're real serious, you've invested in some equipment, you really want to get a great sounding product, there's nothing wrong with looking on the internet or in your phone book for a rental company that'll rent musical equipment and microphones. And some of these mics you could rent for as little as $10 a day or $15 a day. And in a lot of cases, it's well worth it for that day that you're recording the drums. Okay, well, I'm going to show you a typical setup for recording an electric guitar amplifier. Now, I've used two microphones close to the speaker. I've used the 57 again, one of my favorite studio mics for a lot of application, and the 421, which is also one of my favorite studio mics. And again, what I'm going to do with these two mics is use them to equalize the sound. The 57 is going to pick up high-mid punchy frequencies, and the 421 is going to get a little more of the low-mid punch. So it gives me the opportunity to season to taste, so to speak. As I record those two microphones, I could blend them together and get a desired effect. Also a little bit fuller sound than I could with one microphone alone. In addition to the two close mics, I'm going to put a room microphone, a few feet off the amplifier. I'm using the 414 again, a nice condenser mic, nice full-bodied condenser mic picking up full frequency. I may decide after I hear the sound and how it's bouncing off the floor that I need a filter. I certainly could use a pad, but probably won't need it in this case. It's not that big an amplifier. If I was recording a large, high-powered Marshall, I may have to put a pad on this condenser mic. But this is a typical setup. Now, one thing I want to be concerned about is phasing. Now, phasing has to do with what happens in this microphone and this microphone at the same time. In other words, let's say that this is, the even plane. When signals go through the microphones, they sort of push and pull. One goes up and one goes down. So if you've ever seen a sine wave like you see in your workbook, it just comes up and it goes down, it goes up and it goes down. So we want to make sure that both microphones are receiving the signal as it's going up and then also as it's going down. If they're not, we'll have to do what's called reversing the phase, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But we want to make sure we're aware of that whenever we have two microphones on one source. As I'm using two microphones on the bass drum, I'm going to also be concerned with the phasing of those microphones. I know that's a big word, but don't worry about it. We'll define that further later on in the program. So this is really a typical setup for a guitar, and this is a typical setup for drums. Now again, you may not have this elaborate a setup at home, but if you have one or two mics that you've been working with, why not try both of them instead of just one when you're recording a guitar amp? And that way, at least you can give yourself the option of hearing what they sound like both individually and together. This again has you thinking, acting, and performing like a real recording engineer. So great, we've got some microphones on the drums, we've got a few mics on the guitar amp, and in a little while we're